In this video, we're going to talk about temporary truss bracing, what it is, and why it's important. Hi, I'm Chad Johnson. I'm with Truss Components of Washington, and I've been in the truss industry for over 30 years. Let's get started. So, why do we need temporary truss bracing? Well, in simple terms, you could think of a roof truss kind of like a domino. This is our structure, and we've got a roof truss standing up on that structure. Obviously, the truss is much taller than it is wide, and so it wants to fall over like a domino. If we put a bunch of trusses all in a line, they'll all happily come down together if we don't brace them properly. And causes that can bring them down are wind or being bumped, many different ways. And so we need to make sure that we put temporary truss bracing on as we're installing the trusses. So let's talk about how we would do that. Why do we need temporary truss bracing? Well, here's the problem. A single truss is lightweight. It's much taller than it is wide, and simple things like being bumped or even wind can knock it over just like a domino. So while we're installing trusses, we put temporary truss bracing on to make sure that the trusses stay upright, rigid, and in place where they're supposed to be until installation is complete. So why do we need temporary truss bracing? Well, the problem is pretty straightforward. If you think about a truss, it is tall, it's lightweight, it's narrow, and on its own, it's unstable. Simple things like the weight of a worker or a wind gust could blow the truss over if it doesn't have some bracing to help keep it in place. So we put on temporary bracing in order to prevent collapse, in order to maintain our spacing, and also, and most importantly, to protect the workers that are working with the trusses and the structure. So, what types of temporary truss bracing are there? Well, if we think of our standard truss, we've got several planes that we need to keep in line and rigid. And so we've got our top cord, and we'll need top cord temporary bracing. That would typically tie the trusses together along the top cord plane. We've got our bottom cord, and we would put some temporary bracing along the bottom cord in order to keep it on spacing and rigid. And then on the webs, we would also have some temporary bracing, and that would also get some diagonal bracing in order to keep it rigid and run the loads up to the roof and down to the ceiling. So temporary bracing on the roof plane and on the ceiling and on flat trusses especially helps to keep the cords in line and prevent them from buckling under the loads that are imposed on them just from their own weight, let alone any other workers or materials that might be put on them. Now, it's a common practice, but not recommended, to simply stand the trusses and put bracing just perpendicular to the trusses, but it's recommended by the Truss Fabricators Association that those braces also be diagonally attached so that the system can't buckle. One good method for doing this type of bracing so that it doesn't need to be removed later is to do it on the underside of the top cord and on the top of the bottom cord. So we've talked about roof plane bracing, ceiling plane bracing, and web bracing. And keep in mind, this is just a brief overview. I'd recommend that you take a look at the Structural Building Components Association webpage in order to get more information, or talk to your truss manufacturer. But we'll cover a little bit more here as well. So we've got the bracing on the truss package as the trusses are being rolled. It's highly recommended that the bracing be started with the very first truss. And so if we take a look at another view of the same building, let's start with the end wall. And that would be where we'd have our gable end truss. We need to make sure that that first truss has a solid bracing in order to get the entire system off to a good start. And so it's recommended that the first truss be braced down to the ground in order to prevent it from toppling. And then as additional trusses are added, they can be braced back to that truss, as well as have the diagonal bracing or roof sheathing installed as you go in order to keep that plane rigid and prevent it from buckling or toppling. A few do's and don'ts regarding temporary bracing. Let's start with the do's. We do want to make sure that we brace the very first truss well before we get started. Like we mentioned, bracing it down to the ground. That can be inside or outside the building. Follow the BCSI recommendations. We want to make sure that we use the proper material and fasteners, and that could be 2x material with appropriately sized nails. Again, BCSI recommends those depending on the particular use, and we want to follow either the BCSI or the engineer's recommendations. Especially when we get into long span trusses, the BCSI is only valid for trusses up to 60 foot in span. Once you hit that 60-foot mark, then you need an engineer's recommendation for proper temporary bracing. Some things we don't want to do. We don't want to walk on unbraced trusses. Even walking on the bottom cord of an unbraced truss can cause the top cord to buckle and the entire system to come down. We don't want to use damaged or undersized lumber. Now, it's a typical practice out in the field to use what we call suicide blocks, and there's a reason for that. And that would be blocks that are just long enough to go from one truss to the next. You can imagine why they're called suicide blocks. They tend to come down with the trusses in a system. So you want to use bracing that's adequate to tie multiple trusses together and to triangulate that load. That's those diagonal members going along with the bracing that's perpendicular to the trusses. And then, very important, don't remove the temporary bracing before the permanent bracing is installed. That's why it's a good idea to put your bracing on the top of the bottom cord or the bottom of the top cord, and that way you can go ahead and put your sheathing on or put your sealing on, and there's no need to ever remove that bracing. What does a truss look like when it is not properly braced and it's starting to collapse under its own weight? Well, we call that essing. So as you might imagine, the truss starts to take on the shape of an S. So if we start out, for instance, with a long, shallow truss that is not braced, what happens is the top of that truss wants to come down under its own weight. It's not properly braced to any other systems around it. And in order for that top to come down, and the top being longer than the bottom, the top has to become shorter. And the way the top becomes shorter, because the bottom can't become longer, is it starts to make the shape of an S. And so what you'll see in a failing set of trusses is a whole series of these S curves in the trusses. Once it deflects far enough, that top cord will actually buckle and it'll come through the bottom cord and the whole truss system will come down. Looking from the bottom, if you see your set of trusses, the bottoms are straight and the tops are doing this, you've got a problem with your temporary bracing, and this is a very dangerous situation. If you see that, stop, clear out the building, and get some professional help in order to get that straightened out. When should temporary bracing be installed? Well, as mentioned a little bit ago, we want to start with the very first truss. So that first truss, before we go any further, we want to get it braced per the BCSI recommendations so that it can't move. And then as we go down the line, every single truss that we add, we want to put bracing on that as we go. Once you get to a point where you have several trusses installed, then you'll want to put some diagonal bracing on per the BCSI recommendations in order to make sure that that system is triangulated and the cords on those trusses can't buckle as a system. And so we can just keep going. Now, one of the great ways to brace your truss system is after you get a few trusses on, you can start sheeting over the top, and that will help avoid duplicate efforts. But as long as that temporary bracing is on the underside of the top cord, you won't need to remove it in order to do that sheathing. Many times, unfortunately, I've come in on a Monday to a phone call and the contractor says, I put up the trusses last week, it got to Friday afternoon and we were all ready to go home, and we left the trusses over the weekend. They weren't properly braced. A wind came up over the weekend and now all the trusses are on the floor and will need to be replaced. So I would highly recommend, no matter when you're rolling the trusses or how urgently you'd like to get home or go on to the next thing, always brace your trusses well and leave yourself in a good position to come back to a set of trusses that is still standing and ready for you to start sheeting when you come back. What is our recipe for success as we get started setting a truss package? Well, we want to make sure that we have a bracing plan available and studied. That can be from the engineer of record or from the BCSI. We want to make sure that we have a trained crew. Everyone is aware of how the trusses are going to be set and how the bracing is going to be completed. We want to make sure we have the right tools and materials on site, enough materials so that we don't end up skimping as we go. And we want to inspect during the installation and make sure that the trusses and the bracing are behaving as we expect they would. If you follow the recommendations from the BCSI provided by the Structural Building Components Association, the recommendations of the engineer of record or your truss manufacturer, you'll have a smooth and safe and accurate truss install, and you'll be set for the next one. Thanks for watching this video. We'll see you next time.